The official story says it was an ice axe. One blow, one man, one motive. A fanatic acting out of love for the revolution. That is what the textbooks say. That is what Moscow wanted the world to believe. But here's what the textbooks do not say. Pavel Sudoplatov, the Soviet intelligence officer who oversaw the entire operation, later wrote in his memoirs that the primary objective was never the man himself. The primary objective was a folder, a manuscript, a book that, according to Sudoplatov's own account, was described in internal NKVD directives as a document of existential threat to the authority of Comrade Stalin. He allegedly said to his operatives, "The man is a nuisance, the manuscript is the catastrophe." Think about that for a moment. The most powerful secret police apparatus in human history, an organization that had already murdered millions, that had purged entire armies, that had erased the names of old Bolsheviks from photographs and encyclopedias, was not primarily afraid of a 60-year-old exile living behind barbed wire in a suburb of Mexico City. They were afraid of what he was writing. Welcome to one of the 20th century's most dangerous intellectual projects. Welcome to the story of Leon Trotsky's final book. The villa at Avenida Vienna in Coyoacán looked less like a home and more like a small military installation. By the summer of 1939, the compound had been reinforced to resemble something between a medieval garrison and a modern prison, except in this case the walls were meant to keep people out, not in. Steel doors had replaced wooden ones, the windows were bricked up to narrow slits. 2 watchtowers stood at the corners of the property. Armed guards, young men loyal to the 4th International, rotated in shifts around the clock. Inside this fortress, an aging man with a white goatee and thick round glasses sat at a desk, surrounded by thousands of documents. He had no passport. No country would grant him citizenship. Norway had expelled him. France had refused him. Mexico had accepted him only through the personal intervention of the painter Diego Rivera and the sympathy of President Lázaro Cárdenas. He was a man the world had officially discarded. Stripped of Soviet citizenship in 1932, condemned in absentia in the Moscow trials as a traitor, a saboteur, a spy for every foreign power imaginable. And yet he was, without question, the most closely monitored private individual on the planet. His name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. The world knew him as Leon Trotsky, and he was building a bomb, not from metal or powder, but from words, dates, and evidence. The book Trotsky was writing was officially titled Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence. But calling it a biography misses the point entirely. This was not a political memoir or an ideological polemic. It was a forensic investigation. Trotsky was applying the methods of a detective, cross-referencing police archives, tracking chronologies of arrests, mapping the geography of betrayals across the Caucasus in the first decade of the 20th century. He had built a network of correspondence across Europe and the Americas. Former party members, old Georgian revolutionaries, émigrés from Baku and Tiflis, who remembered the early years of the underground. He wrote letters constantly, hundreds of letters, requesting specific documents, asking precise questions about specific dates, specific people, specific events that the official Soviet history had quietly buried. What was he looking for? He was looking for the hidden mechanism beneath the surface of Stalin's rise, not the theatrical villain of Western propaganda, not the ideological monster of the Trotskyist pamphlets, but something far more specific and far more dangerous, a pattern. A structural truth about who Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, known as Koba, had actually been before the revolution, and what that revealed about the nature of the regime he had built. In Moscow, the alarm had been ringing for years. As early as 1938, NKVD intelligence reports about Trotsky had begun to shift in character. Earlier, dispatches focused on his political influence, his speeches, his international contacts, his attempts to build the Fourth International as a rival to the Comintern. But by 1938 and 1939, the reports increasingly focused on something else: the book, specific passages, specific research requests, specific names of people Trotsky was trying to contact. A dedicated surveillance unit, known internally by the code name Gwen Service, was established with the sole purpose of monitoring Trotsky's literary and research activities. This was not about tracking a political opponent. This was about tracking a manuscript. The internal logic was clear to anyone inside the Kremlin hierarchy. Stalin's legitimacy rested on a carefully constructed myth of revolutionary heroism, a story in which the general secretary had been one of the great underground fighters of the Bolshevik cause, risking everything in the struggle against the Tsar. The cult of personality required this foundation. Without it, Stalin was not the heir of Lenin. He was simply a bureaucrat who had outmaneuvered his colleagues during a succession crisis. Trotsky, sitting behind his barricaded walls in Coyoacán, was pulling at the threads of that foundation. The first strike came before dawn on the 24th of May, 1940. A group of approximately 20 armed men, led by the Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, a committed Stalinist, stormed the villa compound. They had police uniforms. They had inside help. They fired over 300 rounds into the bedroom where Trotsky and his wife Natalia were sleeping. By some extraordinary circumstance, both survived by hiding under the bed frame. But here's the detail that every standard account mentions only in passing, if at all. The attackers spent significant time inside the compound, not shooting, but searching. Guards who were later debriefed reported that several members of the raiding party moved through Trotsky's study, pulling open drawers, rifling through filing cabinets, gathering papers. The official narrative frames this as an assassination attempt that failed. The evidence suggests something more precise. This was a retrieval operation that failed, during which the backup option, killing Trotsky, also failed. The manuscript survived. Trotsky survived. And 3 months later, Moscow tried again, this time with a plan 2 years in the making, executed by a single man with a weapon that would not make noise. There is a specific kind of fear that only guilty men understand. It is not the fear of a rival or the fear of an enemy army massing at the border. It is the fear of a witness, someone who was there, who remembers, who has been patient enough and meticulous enough to write it all down. By the spring of 1940, Joseph Stalin had spent the better part of a decade trying to eliminate every witness to his past. He had shot old comrades, fabricated confessions, rewritten encyclopedias, and airbrushed faces out of photographs. He had, with extraordinary thoroughness, attempted to make himself a man without a history. And then there was Trotsky, sitting in his Mexican fortress, writing. The question that drove Trotsky's research, the question he returned to again and again in his letters, his notes, his drafts, was deceptively simple. Who was Koba before the revolution made him Stalin? Not the mythological underground fighter of Soviet hagiography, not the loyal Leninist of the official party histories, the real man. The man who walked the streets of Tiflis and Baku and Batumi in the first decade of the 20th century, when the Bolshevik movement was still a small, fractious, perpetually surveilled underground organization trying to survive in the shadow of the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. The answer Trotsky was assembling piece by piece from the testimony of aging survivors and fragments of pre-revolutionary police documents was not flattering. It was, in fact, explosive. To understand what Trotsky found, or rather, what he was in the process of finding, you need to understand what the Caucasus of 1900 to 1917 actually looked like. This was not the romantic revolutionary underground of Soviet cinema. This was a world of informers, double agents, police provocateurs, and criminal networks operating in parallel with ideological movements. The line between a committed revolutionary and a paid police asset was, in many documented cases, genuinely difficult to draw, because the Okhrana's primary strategy was not to arrest revolutionaries, but to infiltrate them, manage them, and use them to destroy each other. In this environment, a young Georgian named Joseph Jugashvili, tough, calculating, with a talent for organization and a complete absence of sentimentality, carved out a specific and curious role. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily effective at certain tasks, moving money, organizing logistics, coordinating what the Bolsheviks euphemistically called expropriations. armed robberies of banks and postal coaches to fund the party. The most famous of these was the Tiflis expropriation of June 1907, in which a Bolshevik squad attacked a stagecoach carrying money for the state bank in the central square of the city. The operation was spectacular in its audacity. It was also, Trotsky noted carefully in his research notes, a catastrophic political embarrassment because Lenin had officially declared such operations forbidden at the London Congress just weeks earlier. Koba had gone ahead anyway. Trotsky's question was not whether this made Stalin a criminal. Everyone in the underground had bent rules. His question was more precise. How did Koba survive? How did a man who repeatedly defied party discipline, who was repeatedly arrested, who operated in one of the most heavily surveilled regions of the empire, how did he escape again and again with what Trotsky described in his notes as an almost musical regularity? Trotsky built a chronology. This was his primary analytical tool, the simple, devastating act of placing events in sequence and asking why the sequence looked the way it did. He called what he found the phenomenon of the empty chair. The pattern was this. In city after city and year after year, Bolshevik operations in the Caucasus were betrayed to the Okhrana. Safe houses were raided, printing presses were seized, comrades were arrested, and in each case when Trotsky mapped the arrests against the known movements of the key figures in the organization, one name was conspicuously absent from the lists of those detained. Koba had been in Baku, but left 2 days before the raid. Koba had been running the Tiflis network, but was transferred to another city the week before the arrests. Koba had organized the underground printing operation, but was in custody for an unrelated minor charge when the press was found, which conveniently provided him with an alibi. 4 successful escapes from Siberian exile. 4 times in an era when the exile system was specifically designed to be permanent, Koba had walked away. The average Bolshevik exile escaped once, perhaps twice, under desperate circumstances and at enormous personal risk. 4 times in relatively comfortable conditions, with what appeared to be logistical support from sources that were never fully explained. Trotsky wrote to multiple correspondents asking a single question. Was there anyone who could document specifically how these escapes were organized and who provided the resources? The answers he received were fragmentary, but they pointed consistently in one direction. The document that haunted Trotsky's investigation, the document he referenced repeatedly in his letters without ever being able to fully verify, was a single letter allegedly written in 1913 by Colonel Alexei Eremin of the Okhrana's special section in St. Petersburg. The letter, addressed to the Yenisei Regional Police, reportedly instructed local authorities to treat a certain Zhugashvili, Joseph Vissarionovich, with particular leniency, identifying him as an agent who had rendered valuable services to the department and whose operational usefulness depended on maintaining his credibility within revolutionary circles. This was the Eremin letter. Its authenticity has been debated by historians ever since, and that debate is itself a significant part of this story, as we'll see in the 3rd chapter. But for Trotsky in 1939 and 1940, the letter was not the end of the investigation. It was a hypothesis, a direction, a key that might fit a lock he had been trying to open for years. What the letter represented, if genuine, was not merely a personal scandal. It was a structural revelation. It meant that the foundational narrative of Soviet power, the story of Stalin as a heroic underground fighter who had suffered for the revolution, was not just incomplete or exaggerated. It was a constructed myth, built on top of something that was almost precisely its opposite. In Moscow, Lavrenti Beria understood the danger better than anyone. He had spent years in Georgia before his rise to the head of the NKVD, and he knew the Caucasian underground networks personally. He knew which survivors remembered which events. He knew which archives contained which documents. In late 1939, Beria signed an internal directive, later referenced in documents that became accessible after the Soviet collapse, ordering the systematic obstruction of any research requests originating from Trotsky's network. Former party members in Europe who had been corresponding with Trotsky were approached and warned. In several cases, they simply disappeared. Georgian émigrés who had been sharing their memories of the early underground found that their families inside the Soviet Union suddenly became the subject of uncomfortable official attention. The operation was not primarily about violence. It was about closing the archive, severing the information network that Trotsky had spent years building, isolating the investigator from his sources before he could assemble enough evidence to make the case conclusively. It almost worked. By the summer of 1940, Trotsky's correspondence had slowed dramatically. Several of his most valuable contacts had gone silent. The manuscript was incomplete. The chapters covering the Caucasian period were fragmentary, built on strong hypotheses but lacking the documentary foundation he had been seeking. But the hypotheses themselves were already dangerous, because Trotsky had understood something that went beyond the specific question of whether Stalin had been an Okhrana informer. He had understood the deeper structural truth that a man who had built his revolutionary career on the psychology and methods of a provocateur, operating through loyalty networks, manufacturing mutual complicity, surviving by betraying others before they could betray him, would inevitably build a state that operated by the same logic. The manuscript was not just an accusation against one man. It was a diagram of a system, and Stalin, who understood his own system better than anyone, knew exactly how to read it, which is why, on the morning of August 20th, 1940, the man who entered the villa in Coyoacán carrying a mountain ice axe concealed under his raincoat had been given 2 instructions, and only one of them was about Leon Trotsky. There is a term used in intelligence work for an operation that has been running so long through so many layers of preparation that the people executing it no longer fully remember what originally motivated it. The objective becomes mechanical. The handlers pass instructions down through cutouts and intermediaries until the original fear, the raw, specific fear that launched the whole machinery, is buried under years of tradecraft and bureaucratic momentum. Operation Duck was not that kind of operation. Everyone involved, from Beria at the top to the young Spaniard at the bottom, knew exactly what this was about. They knew because the briefings were unusually specific. Most assassination operations focused on the target. This one focused on the target study. His name was Ramon Mercader. He was 26 years old, born in Barcelona, the son of a committed Communist Party activist. He had been recruited, trained, and inserted into Trotsky's circle over a period of nearly 2 years, a timeline that itself speaks to the seriousness with which Moscow approached this mission. This was not a rushed operation improvised after the failure of the Siqueiros raid in May. This was a patient, methodical project of social engineering. Mercader had cultivated a relationship with a young American woman named Sylvia Exiled, a Trotsky supporter with legitimate access to the Coyoacán compound. Under the false identity of a Belgian journalist named Frank Jackson, he had visited the villa multiple times, slowly building trust, presenting himself as a sympathetic intellectual interested in Trotsky's ideas. He had been inside the study. He had seen the desk. He had seen the stacks of manuscript pages, the filing cabinets, the correspondence organized in labeled folders. The final briefing before the operation, as later reconstructed from Mercader's own statements and from Soviet intelligence documents that became partially accessible in the 1990s, included a specific instruction that did not appear in standard assassination protocols. Mercader was told to secure, if at all possible, the folder containing the most recent draft chapters of the Stalin biography, specifically the sections dealing with the Caucasian period. He was told this was the primary objective. He was told the elimination of the subject, while necessary, was secondary to the retrieval of the manuscript. This instruction would prove to be the operation's fatal miscalculation. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1940, Mercader arrived at the villa with a manuscript of his own, an article he had written, ostensibly seeking Trotsky's editorial feedback. This was the pretext. Trotsky, who was feeding his rabbits in the courtyard when Mercader arrived, agreed to review the piece in his study. What happened in that room in the next few minutes has been reconstructed from physical evidence, guard testimony, and Mercader's own later accounts, which were inconsistent in their details but consistent in one particular. The blow came from behind. The ice axe, a compact mountaineering tool chosen precisely because it was silent, struck Trotsky on the right side of the skull. The wound was severe. By any reasonable expectation, it should have been immediately incapacitating. It was not. Trotsky cried out, a long, terrible cry that guards later described as unlike anything human, and turned on his attacker. He fought. A 60-year-old man with a fractured skull fought the trained operative who had just struck him, biting Mercader's hand, grappling with him across the desk, knocking papers to the floor. Guards burst in within seconds and pulled Mercader away. But here's the detail that the standard narrative almost always omits. In the chaos of those seconds before the guards arrived, Mercader had not been trying to strike again. He had been reaching for the desk. Specifically, according to the testimony of Trotsky's secretary, Joseph Hansen, who entered the room immediately after the commotion began, Mercader's hands were in the papers. He was searching. He found nothing. The manuscript, or rather, the most sensitive sections of it, was not on the desk that afternoon. Trotsky, who had become increasingly security conscious in the months following the Siqueiros raid, had developed a habit of keeping his most important drafts in a separate location within the compound, accessible only to himself and his wife, Natalia. Leon Trotsky died in a Mexico City hospital the following day, on August 21st, 1940. He was 60 years old. He had spent the last 4 years of his life building the most dangerous document in the Soviet world. The document survived him. What followed was a different kind of war, quieter, longer, and in many ways more revealing than the assassination itself. Within 48 hours of Trotsky's death, Soviet intelligence assets in Mexico City were attempting to access the villa compound under various pretexts. The Mexican police investigation provided some cover. There were legitimate reasons for officials to be present on the property, but Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's widow, was not naive. She had lived inside the machinery of revolutionary politics for decades. She knew what Moscow wanted, and she knew that the legal chaos surrounding her husband's murder gave her only a narrow window of time. The operation she executed in the weeks following the assassination was remarkably composed for a woman in the grip of grief. Working with a small circle of trusted comrades, she systematically separated the most sensitive materials from the general archive. Documents were duplicated where possible. The most critical papers, Trotsky's research notes on the Caucasian period, his correspondence with sources who had provided information about Stalin's pre-revolutionary activities, the draft chapters of the biography, were packed into containers that would not attract official attention. The containers were wooden crates. They were labeled as household goods. They moved through the Mexican customs system during a period when the bureaucratic attention of multiple governments was focused on the broader chaos of the Second World War, which had been raging in Europe for nearly a year. The archive arrived in the United States in fragments over a period of months. By 1941, the core of what would become known as the Trotsky Archive was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, under the protection of Harvard University. A formal agreement was reached. The archive would be held by Harvard's Houghton Library and would remain sealed, closed to researchers, until 1980. 4 decades of enforced silence. 4 decades is a long time, long enough, as it turned out, for a different kind of operation to do its work. Soviet intelligence had failed to retrieve the manuscript. They had failed to destroy the archive, but they had understood with a clarity that reflected genuine strategic sophistication that physical destruction was only one method of neutralizing dangerous information. There was another method, subtler, more durable, and ultimately more effective. You do not need to burn a book if you can convince the world the book is not worth reading. The operation that intelligence historians have referred to as Project Iris. The name appears in fragmentary references in documents from Soviet defector testimony in the 1950s and 60s, was not a single coordinated program with a formal structure. It was more like a sustained effort of narrative management conducted through agents of influence embedded in Western academic and journalistic circles. The goal was specific: to ensure that when Trotsky's archive finally opened, the intellectual environment surrounding its reception would already be shaped by decades of skepticism about Trotsky as a reliable historical source. The arguments were not crude, they were in fact quite sophisticated. Trotsky was framed as a bitter exile with obvious personal motives to defame Stalin. His research methods were questioned. He was, after all, working from a distance, without access to primary Soviet archives. The specific question of whether Stalin had been an Okhrana informer was deliberately seeded with false versions of the Eremin letter, forgeries that were slightly too obvious, designed to be debunked, so that the debunking of the forgery would splash backwards onto the original hypothesis and contaminate it by association. This is a technique worth pausing on because it is extraordinarily elegant in its design. You take a genuine historical question. You introduce a clumsy forgery that supports one answer to that question. You then publicly expose the forgery. And in the minds of casual observers, the exposure of the forgery becomes the exposure of the underlying question itself, as though the question had been answered when in fact only the fake evidence had been discredited. By the time the Trotsky archive opened at Harvard in 1980, the Western academic world was, in many quarters, already predisposed to treat Trotsky's Stalin research as the work of a polemicist rather than an investigator. The archive was studied. Scholars wrote papers. The manuscript was eventually published in its incomplete form, but the reception was muted, filtered through decades of carefully cultivated doubt. The operation had not destroyed the information. It had done something more lasting. It had managed the context in which the information would be received. And so we arrive at the paradox that sits at the center of this entire story. The paradox that Trotsky himself, in his final months, was beginning to articulate in terms that went beyond the specific question of Stalinist biography. Whether or not Yosef Jugashvili was formally registered as an Okhrana agent, whether the Eremin letter is authentic, whether the pattern of arrests and escapes represents deliberate betrayal or extraordinary luck, may ultimately be less important than the question Trotsky was actually building toward in his manuscript. His real argument was not biographical. It was structural. It was this: that a man who had survived the revolutionary underground by mastering the psychology of the double agent, by learning to think simultaneously as a revolutionary and as an informer, by building networks of loyalty through shared criminal complicity rather than shared ideological commitment, by treating every relationship as a potential asset or a potential threat. Such a man, when given state power, would inevitably build a state that operated on those same principles. The Soviet state under Stalin was not a revolutionary government that had been corrupted. It was a provocateurs' organization that had been scaled up. The show trials were not aberrations. They were the underground tribunal logic of a criminal network applied to an entire society. The purges were not paranoia. They were the informer's instinct, the knowledge that in a system built on betrayal, the only security lies in betraying first. The cult of personality was not vanity. It was the provocateur's ultimate cover story, the legend so thoroughly constructed that it eventually became impossible to separate from reality. This is what Stalin feared in the manuscript, not the specific accusation of having been an Okhrana agent. He feared the demonstration of the mechanism, the moment when a reader could look at the structure of Soviet power and recognize in its deepest logic the psychology of the double game. Because once you see that mechanism, you cannot unsee it. And once you can describe it clearly in historical terms with documented evidence, it becomes a tool, a template that can be applied not just to one man and one regime, but to any system built on fear, complicity, and the manufactured loyalty of people who are bound together not by what they believe, but by what they have done. Ramon Mercader served 20 years in a Mexican prison. Upon his release in 1960, he traveled to the Soviet Union, where he was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest state honor. He lived out the rest of his life in Moscow and Havana, a quiet man who rarely spoke about what had happened in that study in Coyoacán. The incomplete manuscript of Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence, was published posthumously, edited by Trotsky's American collaborator Charles Malamuth. The Caucasian chapters, the ones Trotsky had been building toward, the sections that contained the most explosive hypotheses, remained fragmentary. The central argument was present but unfinished. The evidence was suggestive but incomplete. The archive at Harvard has been open for over 40 years now. Scholars continue to work through it. The question of Stalin's relationship to the Okhrana remains technically unresolved, neither proven nor definitively disproven, floating in that carefully managed zone of historical uncertainty that the architects of Project Iris had worked so hard to create and maintain. But Trotsky's deeper argument, the structural one, the one about what a provocateur's psychology does when it is given a state to run, that argument has aged remarkably well. Every generation of historians who studies it finds new applications. Every decade produces new regimes that fit the template with uncomfortable precision. The forbidden manuscript was never fully written, but its central idea turned out to be indestructible, not because anyone protected it, but because history kept providing new evidence for it. The man with the ice axe won the battle. The idea he was sent to bury won everything else.